What if you're wrong? Not about everything. Maybe just one thing. Something you believed for years. Something you've defended. Something you've argued about. Something you've built part of your identity around. What would it take for you to change your mind? More evidence? A better argument? Someone you trust telling you? Or would you simply dig in deeper? Because here's an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe one of the greatest obstacles between us and the truth isn't a lack of information. Maybe it's us. Last episode we asked question. Is something true even if nobody believed it? Today, I want to turn that question around. Because if truth exists independently of what I believe, then I have to leave room for one terrifying possibility. I might be wrong. And if I really care about truth, I have to be willing to find out. So let's walk. Welcome back to Crusade With Me. This is a podcast about life's deeper questions, the ones we usually don't have time to think about because we're too busy living. We're searching for truth, not my truth, not your truth, not whatever happens to be popular this week. Truth. Sometimes seeking truth means looking outwardly at the world. Sometimes it means looking backward toward ancient wisdom. But sometimes, and this is probably the hardest one, it means looking directly at ourselves. Because it's easy to question everybody else. It's much harder to question yourself. So today we're going to ask something that sounds simple. What if I'm wrong? Not as an exercise in self-doubt, but as an exercise in humility. Because maybe being wrong isn't the greatest danger. Maybe the greatest danger is becoming someone who can no longer be corrected. We just don't have beliefs, we become them. Think about something you strongly believe. Don't pick something easy. Pick something that matters. Politics. Religion. Marriage. Parenting. Money, work, success. I don't care. Maybe something about yourself. Now imagine someone telling you you're wrong. Notice what happens inside of you. You probably don't immediately think, excellent new information. Let's be honest. No. Something tightens. Something prepares a defense. Before we've even considered the argument, we're already building the rebuttal. Why? Because beliefs aren't always just ideas floating around inside our heads. We attach ourselves to them. We build identities around them, and eventually questioning the belief can feel like questioning us. That's where truth-seeking gets difficult. Because now I'm no longer asking, is this true? I'm asking, what happens to me if this isn't true? And those are two completely different questions. So here's some questions I want to throw out here that I just want you listeners to think about. What belief would be the hardest for you to discover was wrong? How about this one? When somebody challenges something you believe, do you become curious or defensive? Here's another one. Have you ever defended an idea simply because admitting you were wrong would have been embarrassing? And here's the big one. Do you want to know what's true, or do you want to prove you're right? We've all had those experiences, right? I know I have. Several years ago, not really that many years ago, 6, 7 years ago, I guess 7 or 8 years ago, we had a tradition of doing a New Year's Day hike every year. This was during a time we lived down in Arkansas, and there were some beautiful places to hike in north central Arkansas. And I remember on this hike, and Kath and I had done it a few times, that the trail we were on, we had hiked it a couple of times before because it was a several mile hike, and there's a lot of elevation changes, believe it or not, in north central Arkansas. And you end up in they call it the big house, the big Indian house, which is truly nothing more than a gigantic overhang cave. And we had hiked there back to that several times. And this New Year's Day, Kathy's oldest brother and his bride were with us. And we come to a fork in the trail, and I take the fork. I am convinced I know this is the way to go. And Kathy and so my sister-in-law follows me. Kathy's saying, I don't think it's right. So she goes the other fork, which is actually down the elevation. I'm going up elevation. And her brother follows her, which I'm glad he did. After walking for about 10 minutes, maybe 5, I realize I am definitely on the wrong path. And got all sorts of turned around. And thank goodness my sister-in-law was in pretty good shape. Not that I'm in good shape, it's just that I felt bad that she's dragging around this hillside or mountainside, as they call them down there. And I finally get back to a river and stream that I recognize and know. And I cross the river and then find Kathy and her brother. I was absolutely convinced. I was when I took off, I'm like, I know. And Kathy's going to be, way behind trying to catch up when she figures out. But I was wrong. Definitely wrong. And my legs and thighs can tell you absolutely I was wrong. And I paid for that. Here's something I want you to consider. Your brain is a very good lawyer. And I believe that to be fascinating and a little bit frightening about the human mind. Once an idea gets into our heads, getting it back out isn't nearly as simple as presenting better information. Psychologists have studied something called the continued influence effect. Now, here's the basic idea. We're given information about something. We incorporate that information into the story we're building in our minds. Later, somebody comes along and says, hey, that original information was wrong. Here's the correction. You would think our brains could simply delete the old information and replace it with the new. It doesn't necessarily work that way. Research has found that the original misinformation can continue affecting how we reason even after we've been told it was wrong. Think about how important that is. The first explanation you hear about a person, the first story you hear about an event, something your parents told you when you were a kid, something a teacher taught you, something you heard about another religion, another political party, another race, another generation, another country. Something somebody told you about yourself. You're not good at that. People like us don't do that. That's just the way the world works. An idea gets planted. And once it's in there, your brain begins building a model of reality around it. Greg Braden, I've read several of his books, explores something related in his book titled The Spontaneous Healing of Belief. The extent to which the beliefs we've acquired about ourselves and our world can shape how we experience our lives. Now combine that with something we talked about earlier, confirmation bias. Once I believe something, I become remarkably good at finding evidence that supports it, and remarkably talented at explaining away evidence that doesn't. Which brings me back to my favorite way of thinking about this. Your brain can become a very good defense attorney, and its client is you. Its job isn't always to find the truth. Sometimes its job becomes protect the story, protect the identity, protect the ego, protect the worldview, protect the tribe, protect whatever we've always believed. And here's what makes this dangerous. You can be completely sincere while being completely wrong. Sincerity isn't the same thing as truth. So here's a question I'm going to throw at you. What did you learn first about something that you later discovered wasn't true? Is there something you believe today primarily because somebody you trusted told it to you years ago? When contradictory evidence appears, do you investigate it or immediately start looking for what's wrong with it? And here's one I want you to sit with for a while. How much of what you call my beliefs did you actually choose, and how much did you inherit? Let me tell you some things that I was told when I was young that as an adult I found out, that ain't true. When I was young, I remember, and I wasn't all that young either. I mean, this wasn't that many years ago. When you would go to a grocery store and shop, there was no questions. The way they packaged your food or whatever you bought at the grocery store, it was put into a brown paper bag. And the fella doing it at the end, his name was the bag boy, right? Because he was generally a junior high or high school kid. And then I remember they came out with this thing about we're going to save the world. We're going to save the trees of the world. We got to use these plastic bags. And these years later, do you know what those plastic bags are? They certainly weren't the solution to the problem, were they? I call that plastic bags now urban tumbleweed. They're everywhere. They are. They are everywhere. That's just something general. I mean, but I want to be clear, and that's just something general I was thinking of, and that. But nobody lied to me. They believed it too. And that's the fascinating part. Sometimes beliefs don't get passed down because they're true. They get passed down because the person handing them to you believes believes that they're true. When the tribe punishes the question, and I want to make this hard, because sometimes changing your mind doesn't just mean changing an opinion. Sometimes it costs you something. Human beings desperately want to belong. Family, friends, church, political party, workplace, community, online groups, and every group develops boundaries. Things we're expected to believe, things we're allowed to question, things we're not supposed to question. And that's where we need to talk about something uncomfortable. Cancel culture. You know, I know that term has become so politically loaded that merely saying it can make people choose sides. So forget the politics for a minute. I'm talking about the underlying human behavior. What happens when disagreement is punished with social exclusion? And let's be fair about this. This isn't something one political party invented. Research published in the Journal of Politics found Democrats and Republicans were similarly motivated to sanction disagreeable or offensive speech. Interestingly, that same research found that Americans overestimate how likely other people are to cancel someone. So I think both findings matter, because I'm not interested in exaggerating the problem. I'm interested in what the fear of the problem does to us. When people believe something, the wrong thing, or when people believe saying the wrong thing could cost them a friendship or their reputation, their job, their standing in the community, their social media account, whatever, what happens? Eventually, some people stop speaking. And research on cancel culture specifically raises that concern. Social sanctioning can encourage self-censorship, even while it also serves the legitimate purpose of discouraging genuinely harmful speech. And that's an important distinction. Because you know me. And I have a strong belief accountability is necessary. If I hurt someone, lie about someone, threaten someone, or behave terribly, calling the consequences cancel culture doesn't magically absolve me. We've already talked about that accountability on this podcast. Remember, reality always sends the bill. But accountability and enforced conformity aren't necessarily the same thing. Because here's the question I'm interested in. What happens when someone discovers something true, but telling the truth violates the accepted story of their tribe? That's when truth becomes expensive. And history is filled with people who paid dearly for saying, I don't think that's true. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they were right. And sometimes everybody around them was absolutely certain they were wrong. Until they weren't. That's why a culture capable of seeking truth has to leave room for disagreement. Because if the penalty for asking the wrong question becomes high enough, eventually people stop asking questions. And when people stop asking questions, bad ideas don't disappear. They become protected. So here's some questions I want you to think about. Is there something that you believe but you wouldn't say publicly? Have you ever stayed quiet because telling people what you actually thought was worth the trouble? Or have you ever pretended to agree because you wanted to remain part of the group? Have you ever participated in shutting someone down instead of listening to what they were saying? And here's the real uncomfortable one. If telling the truth cost you your tribe, would you still tell it? Before we get too proud of ourselves and imagine that we'd be the courageous truth teller standing against the mob, there's another possibility we need to consider. What if the tribe isn't wrong? What if I'm the one who's wrong? And that brings us to three of the hardest words in the English language. I was wrong. Maybe you're Galileo, or maybe you're just wrong. Are you humble enough to find out? I was wrong. 3 words. Should be easy. They're not. Because we tend to think admitting we're wrong makes us weaker. I personally think the opposite may be true. Think about the person who could say, I believed that for years. I looked at the evidence again. I listened. I learned something, and I changed my mind. That's not weakness. That requires enormous strength. Because humility isn't thinking less of yourself. Humility is accepting that reality doesn't have to ask your permission. Maybe maturity isn't becoming more certain about everything. Maybe maturity is learning where certainty belongs. There are things I believed at 20. I don't believe at 61. There's things I believed at 40 that I would explain differently today. And I hope that's true. Because if I spent decades living, reading, failing, succeeding, loving, suffering, praying, working, raising children, becoming a grandfather, talking with people, and none of that has ever changed my mind, then what exactly have I been learning? Here's some more questions. Let me get a swig of coffee. Okay, here's some more questions for you. When was the last time you said I was wrong without adding but? What have you changed your mind about during the last 10 years? Who has permission to correct you? And perhaps the most important, are you becoming more teachable as you get older or less? "40 years ago, starting in manufacturing as a supervisor, I had this belief. I had this belief that I had to be the tough guy, the guy that had all the answers, the guy that could stare somebody down. Kind of a straw boss attitude. Straw bosses were generally maybe not the smartest guy in the gang made the straw boss, but he was certainly the biggest and strongest, and people feared him. And early on in my career, I thought that was what I was supposed to be. It's embarrassing thinking back all these years later. You know, Mom tried to help me. Growing up, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard her say, "You get more bees with honey." I was wrong. And I'm not going to put a but to that. I was wrong. Now, I want to be real candid. I still work. Don't know how much longer because the pendulum has swung, and society's pendulum has swung, and we're getting to, I talk about accountability. I'm going to be honest, in the 21st century in manufacturing, that's a hard thing to get to. Accountability. That's another matter altogether. I can say this. Thank God I wasn't required to remain the person I used to be. So what if being wrong is actually an invitation? And here's where I think this is getting really interesting. What if discovering you're wrong is an humiliation? What if it's an invitation? Because think about what happens when you discover you've been walking in the wrong direction. You don't have to keep walking that way. You can turn around. There's an ancient Greek word, metanoia. We often translate it as repentance. And immediately that word becomes loaded with religious baggage. But underneath it is the idea of changing mind, a turning, a reorientation, seeing differently, and then living differently because you see differently. That's fascinating to me. Because we've somehow turned changing your mind into weakness. Ancient wisdom often treated the willingness to be corrected as the beginning of wisdom. Maybe the goal isn't to become someone who's never wrong, because that's impossible. Maybe the goal is becoming someone who can recognize truth when it confronts him and turn toward it. And that's where this becomes more philosophical, because if truth exists, and truth isn't something I manufacture, then the purpose of seeking truth isn't merely to possess it. Maybe the purpose is to allow truth to change me. And eventually, Christianity makes an even more radical claim. Not merely that truth exists, not merely that truth can be discovered, but that truth came looking for us. Jesus didn't say that he knew the truth. He said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. That is a staggering claim. And I'm not asking you to accept it simply because I said it. Quite the opposite. I'm asking you to investigate it, question it, wrestle with it. Test the assumptions you've inherited from religion and from culture around you. Because if we're really going to say the truth is worth seeking, then we can't be afraid of where the search might lead. So, what if you're wrong about something important? I am. You are. Every person listening to this is wrong about something. The question isn't whether we're wrong. The question is, can we still be corrected? Can I hear something I didn't like without immediately rejecting it? Can I listen to someone I disagree with without turning them into an enemy? Can I examine the beliefs I inherited? Can I question my beliefs my culture handed me? Can I question myself? And when reality finally shows me that I've been wrong, can I say, I was wrong? And turn around. Because maybe wisdom isn't knowing everything. Maybe wisdom begins when we finally become teachable. And maybe the person closest to truth isn't the person shouting, I know I'm right. Maybe it's the person quietly asking, what if I'm wrong? You know, there's another question hiding. It just hit me under everything we've talked about today. Because I'm willing to admit that I can be wrong. And if truth exists independently of what I think, then we eventually have to ask, how do we actually know what's true? Reason? Experience? Science? Tradition? Feelings? Consciousness? Or consensus? Revelation? What do we trust? And perhaps more importantly, why do we trust it? That's where we'll be going next. This is Crusade With Me. We're not here because we have everything figured out. We're here because the truth is worth seeking. So ask the hard question. Listen carefully. Stay humble enough to be corrected. Keep your eyes open. Keep your mind open. And keep walking. One faithful step. One honest conversation. One act of courage. One question at a time. And as always, crusade with me.